My name is Hannah Whitmore. I was 37 years old, living in Springfield, Missouri, USA, when everything I thought I knew about faith, church, and truth was shattered forever. Before that day, my life looked normal. Painfully normal. I worked as a school administrative assistant, the kind of job where people smile at you in the hallway but never really ask how you're doing. I was married for 12 years, divorced for 2, no children, quiet house, quiet nights, too quiet. On Sundays, I went to church, not because I felt close to God, but because I was afraid of what it might mean if I stopped. I knew how to lift my hands at the right moment. I knew when to say amen. I knew the language, the rituals, the songs. But inside, something was wrong. Every sermon felt polished, rehearsed, safe. Every answer felt pre-packaged. And every time I asked deeper questions about suffering, truth, obedience, money, power, the room went cold. I was told, don't question so much. Just have faith. Trust the leaders God appointed. Yet at night, alone in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I whispered prayers that felt like they hit a wall. God, are you really like this? Is this really what you want from us? Why does your presence feel so far away in your own house? I wasn't rebelling. I wasn't angry. I was scared that I believed in God, but no longer trusted the institution that claimed to speak for him. The church talked constantly about love, but I saw fear. They preached humility, but I saw pride. They warned about sin, but never about deception inside their own walls. Still, I stayed, because I thought leaving meant losing God. What I didn't know was that God was already preparing to tear the veil away, not gently, but completely. And it would happen on a day that began just like any other. Before I continue, have you ever felt close to God but distant from the church? Have you ever stayed silent because questioning felt dangerous? Right, I've felt this. Or, I'm questioning too, in the comments. You have no idea how important your honesty is right now. The church I attended and the questions no one answered. The church I attended was one of the largest in our area. From the outside, it looked alive. Bright banners, full parking lot. Music so loud you could feel it in your chest before you even walked through the doors. People called it a healthy church. They said it was blessed. They said, God is really moving there. And maybe he was. But something else was moving too. Something quieter, heavier, harder to name. Every Sunday felt like a production. Perfect lighting, perfect transitions, perfect smiles. The pastor spoke confidently, with the kind of certainty that made you feel small if you disagreed. He talked a lot about obedience, about submission, about covering, about how dangerous it was to question spiritual authority. And every time he said those words, my chest tightened. Because the Jesus I read about in Scripture didn't silence honest questions, he invited them. Yet here, questions felt like betrayal. Once, during a small group discussion, I gently asked why the church spent so much time talking about prosperity, but so little time talking about repentance, humility, or caring for the broken. The room went silent. Someone laughed nervously. Another woman avoided eye contact. The group leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said, "We don't focus on negative topics here. Faith means speaking life." I nodded, but inside something cracked. Another time, I asked why so many people were leaving quietly, without explanation. Friends who once served every week, gone. Their names never mentioned again. I was told they weren't spiritually aligned, as if that explained everything. The more I watched, the more patterns I noticed. Money sermons came often. Accountability sermons never came at all. Leaders were protected, members were replaceable. Public image mattered more than private truth. And yet, the scariest part wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't say. No warnings about deception. No teaching on discernment. No reminders that even churches can drift away from truth. It was always, we are right. Always, God is doing something special here. Always, stay, submit, don't question. I remember sitting in the back row one Sunday watching people cry during worship, hands lifted, tears falling. And suddenly a thought pierced me so sharply it almost felt like a voice. What if they're sincere, but misled? That thought terrified me, because sincerity doesn't protect you from deception. I started reading my Bible differently, slower, more carefully, without sermon notes, without commentary. And what I found didn't always match what I heard on Sundays. Jesus warned about false shepherds, about wolves in sheep's clothing, about leaders who loved praise, power, and control. But those verses were rarely mentioned. When I brought this up to a mentor, she looked genuinely afraid. She whispered, "Be careful. That kind of thinking can open doors to doubt." But I wasn't doubting God. I was doubting them. And deep down, I knew that was unforgivable. The pressure to conform became subtle but constant. If I didn't volunteer, I was lukewarm. If I didn't give more, I lacked faith. If I asked too much, I was prideful. So I learned to stay quiet. I smiled, I served, I clapped at the right moments. But inside, my prayers changed. They weren't polished anymore. They were desperate. God, please. If this isn't you, show me. If I'm wrong, correct me. But if something here is broken, don't let me be blind. I didn't realize it then, but that prayer was dangerous. Because when you sincerely ask God for truth, He doesn't always answer gently. Sometimes, He answers in a way that stops your heart. And that answer was closer than I imagined. Before I go on, have you ever felt pressured to stay silent in church? Have you ever sensed something was wrong but were afraid to say it out loud? Write, "I stayed quiet," or "I felt the pressure" in the comments. You're not alone, even if it felt that way. The day that started like any other, but didn't end that way. January 11th began without warning. No signs, no strange feelings, no sense that anything extraordinary was about to happen. I woke up before my alarm, as usual. The sky outside my bedroom window was still gray, winter light barely breaking through the clouds. I remember lying there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the heater, thinking about how tired I felt. Not physically, but deep inside. I got dressed for work, brewed my coffee, and stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through my phone. News headlines, church announcements, another reminder about an upcoming vision offering. I sighed. Before leaving, I paused by the door, something I didn't normally do, and whispered a short prayer. God, please don't let me keep living a lie. Whatever the truth is, I want it, even if it costs me. I had no idea how literal that prayer would become. The drive to work was uneventful at first. Traffic was light. The radio played softly in the background. I remember passing the same intersections I had passed thousands of times before, completely unaware that this would be the last time I'd see them that way. About 15 minutes from my office, the weather shifted. A light rain began to fall, turning the roads slick. Cars slowed. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, annoyed more than concerned. Then it happened. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a sudden loss of control. The car in front of me braked unexpectedly. I reacted too late. Tires skidded. The sound of metal scraping metal filled the air. Time didn't speed up. It slowed. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. The impact was violent but brief. Airbags deployed. Glass shattered. My body lurched forward and then back, pain blooming everywhere at once. Sharp, overwhelming, disorienting. Then, silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful. The kind that feels wrong. I was aware of my body, but I couldn't move it. My chest felt heavy. Breathing became shallow, each breath harder than the last. Sounds came and went. Distant voices, sirens far away, someone shouting. But they felt detached, like they belonged to another world. Fear surged. Not panic. Something deeper. A realization. I'm dying. It wasn't a thought I argued with. It arrived fully formed, calm, and terrifying at the same time. My vision blurred. The edges of everything darkened. And then something strange happened. The fear began to dissolve. As my body weakened, my awareness sharpened. The pain faded first. Then the noise. Then the weight. It felt like slipping out of a heavy coat I'd been wearing my entire life. I remember thinking, so this is how it ends. But there was no despair. Only release. My last clear sensation was a deep, unexpected peace. The kind I had searched for in church pews and worship songs but never quite found. And then, I was no longer inside my body. I was above it. I could see the wreckage, the twisted metal, the flashing lights, paramedics working urgently, someone calling my name. But none of it felt like me anymore. I felt whole, awake, clear. more alive than I had ever felt before. I realized I wasn't breathing, yet I wasn't suffocating. I wasn't thinking with words, yet I understood everything. And in that moment, hovering between worlds, a certainty settled over me. This is not the end. Whatever was happening, it was only beginning. Before I continue, have you ever felt like life could change in a single second? Do you believe there's more beyond this world? Or are you unsure? Write, "I believe," or "I'm not sure" in the comments. Your honesty matters more than you know. The accident. No one expected. What I didn't understand at first was that the accident itself wasn't the most shocking part. It was how unimportant it suddenly felt. From where I was, no longer limited by pain, fear, or gravity, the scene below looked fragile, almost temporary, like something that belonged to a world I had already outgrown. I watched as strangers rushed around my body with urgency and concern. Their movements were fast, coordinated, intense. I could see their mouths moving, their hands working, their focus locked onto a form that no longer felt like me. And yet, I felt no desire to return to it. That realization startled me more than the accident ever could. I should have been afraid. I should have been desperate to live. I should have felt unfinished. But instead, I felt complete. Memories began to surface, not as a slideshow, not as judgment, but as understanding. Moments from my life appeared with clarity. Conversations, choices, compromises, silences. I didn't relive them emotionally. I understood them. I saw how often I had chosen comfort over truth, how often I had stayed quiet to avoid conflict, how often I had trusted systems more than my own discernment. There was no condemnation in this awareness, only honesty. And then something shifted. The environment around me began to fade, not abruptly, but gently, like fog lifting under morning sunlight. The noise of sirens dissolved. The colors of the physical world softened. Ahead of me, something else was forming. A brightness, not blinding, not harsh, alive. It didn't come from a source. It was the source. The closer I drifted toward it, the more I sensed intention. This wasn't randomness. This wasn't imagination. This was invitation. And with that invitation came a knowing. You are seen. You are known. You are safe. Every insecurity I had ever carried, every fear of being wrong, unworthy, unnoticed, fell away effortlessly. Not because I was reassured with words, but because the truth was undeniable. I wasn't approaching light. I was approaching truth itself. As I moved closer, I became aware of something else. A presence. Not multiple, not abstract, personal. Authority without threat. Power without intimidation. Holiness without distance. I didn't need to be told who it was. I knew. And the knowing made me tremble, not with fear, but with reverence. The presence communicated without sound, without language, yet perfectly clear. You have confused my voice with many others. That single statement pierced deeper than any sermon I had ever heard. In an instant, I understood what had taken years of confusion to form on earth. I had listened to charisma instead of truth, confidence instead of obedience, institutions instead of intimacy. The presence wasn't angry, but it was unmistakably serious. The light intensified, not outwardly, but inwardly. It felt as if something inside me was being aligned, straightened, corrected. And then I was shown something, not a vision of fire or destruction, but of people, crowds of sincere believers, praying, singing, serving, yet walking in patterns shaped more by tradition and fear than by truth. They weren't evil. They were misled. And the ones guiding them knew more than they admitted. That realization broke something inside me, because I recognized faces. I recognized language. I recognized systems I had trusted. The presence communicated again. Many speak in my name. Few speak my truth. I felt an overwhelming sorrow. Not personal guilt, but grief. Grief for those who had handed their discernment to leaders. Grief for those who believed obedience to men was obedience to God. And then came the warning. Clear, direct, urgent. The church has learned how to gather crowds, but forgotten how to guard truth. The words weren't accusatory. They were diagnostic. I understood then that this wasn't about one denomination, one building, or one pastor. It was about a pattern, a slow drift, a dangerous substitution of comfort for conviction. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to explain myself. But there was nothing to explain. Everything was already known. Instead, a question was placed inside me, not asked, but offered. Are you willing to return and speak what many will reject? The thought of returning to my body, to pain, to confusion, to disbelief, it felt unbearable. Why would I leave this clarity? Why would anyone? Yet I understood something crucial in that moment. Truth doesn't exist to comfort us. It exists to transform us. And transformation always costs something. Before I go on, have you ever wondered if sincerity alone is enough? Do you think the church can drift away from truth without realizing it? Write, "This scares me," or "I see it too" in the comments. Your response matters more than you think. When my body let go. The moment my body finally let go wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It wasn't frightening. It was quiet. There was a subtle shift, like a door closing softly behind me. No pain, no struggle, just a gentle release, as if my body had completed its role and stepped aside. I realized something important then. My body hadn't been me. It had been a vessel, and for the first time, I understood how heavy that vessel had been. The physical world faded completely, replaced by a depth of awareness I didn't know was possible. I wasn't floating or falling, I simply was. Fully present, fully conscious, without limits. Time didn't exist the way it does here. There was no past or future pressing in on me. Everything felt immediate, clear, whole. And with that clarity came understanding. Not judgment. Understanding. I saw how much of my life had been shaped by fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of disappointing others, fear that kept me compliant, fear that kept me silent. I saw how often I had confused belonging with truth. The realization didn't hurt, it healed. Because with it came compassion, not only for myself, but for everyone still struggling under the same weight. Then something unexpected happened. I felt a deep sense of responsibility. Not guilt, responsibility. As if knowledge itself carried weight. The more I understood, the more I sensed that truth is never given merely for personal peace. It demands movement. It asks something in return. And that's when the presence returned. Closer now. Clearer. The same authority. The same overwhelming peace. The same unmistakable identity. There was no physical form, yet the presence felt more real than anything I had ever known. I didn't see eyes, but I felt seen. I didn't hear words, but I understood perfectly. And I understood something else too. This presence was not impressed by titles, platforms, or crowds. Only by obedience to truth. I was shown scenes, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as instruction. Moments where people had chosen comfort over conviction. Moments where leaders had softened truth to keep influence. Moments where silence had done more damage than open rebellion. And again, the emphasis wasn't anger, it was urgency. The presence communicated, many are taught to follow voices instead of discernment. Many confuse loyalty to institutions with loyalty to me. Those words echoed through me with a weight I can't fully explain, because I had lived them. I had excused things that felt wrong because they were popular. I had trusted confidence more than character. I had accepted explanations that kept me comfortable instead of searching for truth. And suddenly, I understood why confusion was spreading so easily among believers. They were being taught what to think, not how to discern. The presence showed me something else, something personal. I saw myself returning to a body that would feel heavy again, returning to a world where people would doubt, mock, argue, returning to a church culture that would resist what I had seen. And my first response was resistance. Why would anyone believe me? Why would I trade this peace for rejection? The answer came without words. Because love warns. Because truth is not optional. Because silence helps deception grow. I realized then that what I was being shown wasn't just about the church as a system. It was about individual hearts. People who loved God sincerely, but had handed over their discernment. People who equated spiritual safety with conformity. People who feared questioning more than deception. I was shown that many leaders weren't openly evil. They were simply unwilling to lose control. And that made them dangerous. That understanding broke my heart, not in despair, but in compassion. Because deception doesn't usually arrive as darkness. It arrives dressed as light. And that's when I felt it. The pull. A gentle, persistent drawing backward. Toward my body. Toward the world. Toward responsibility. I didn't want to go. Not because I hated life, but because I finally understood it. Yet the presence made something unmistakably clear. This knowledge is not yours to keep. I was given a final assurance before the return began. You will not be alone. Those who are meant to hear will hear. And with that, the clarity began to narrow. The vastness receded. The weight returned. I felt myself moving, not violently, not suddenly, but reluctantly, like waking from the deepest, most peaceful sleep. Before I continue, do you believe truth always comes with responsibility? Have you ever felt called to speak up but stayed silent out of fear? Write, "I stayed silent," or "I feel the call" in the comments. Your response matters, even if no one else sees it. Leaving my body didn't feel like escape. It felt like remembering. As the pull back toward the physical world paused for a moment, I became fully aware of what it meant to exist without limits. There was no weight, no resistance, no confusion. Thought and understanding were instant, not processed, not debated, just known. I realized then how much of human life is spent filtering truth through fear, ego, and expectation. Here, none of that existed. There was no need to defend myself, no need to explain, no need to perform. I simply was. I became aware of the space around me. Not a place with walls or edges, but a realm of presence. It felt alive, not with movement, but with intention. Everything carried meaning. And within that awareness, I understood something profound. I had not gone somewhere. I had returned to something familiar. This wasn't foreign. This wasn't strange. This was home. That realization overwhelmed me more than anything else. Because if this felt like home, what did that say about the world I had been clinging to so tightly? I sensed that my life on Earth, all the striving, the anxiety, the endless effort to get it right, had been lived under a false urgency, a pressure created by systems, expectations, and fear-based teaching. Here, urgency existed, but it wasn't frantic. It was purposeful. I became aware again of the presence, closer now, not approaching, but surrounding. There was no separation between being seen and being known. And then I understood something that shook me deeply. I was not the only one here, not in a crowded sense, but in a connected one. I felt the awareness of others, not faces, not bodies, but consciousness, lives, stories, journeys, each unique, each known. There was no hierarchy, no celebrity, no platform, just truth. And in that truth, I realized how distorted many of our earthly structures had become. I understood that leadership, as it was meant to be, was never about control. It was about guidance. And guidance without humility becomes manipulation. The presence communicated again, not with sound, but with clarity that bypassed thought. You have learned to measure success by numbers. I measure faithfulness by obedience. Those words dismantled years of assumptions in seconds. I saw how churches celebrated growth without depth, how influence replaced integrity, how popularity was mistaken for approval, and I saw how easily fear was used. Fear of being outside, fear of being wrong, fear of losing salvation, to keep people aligned. That fear did not come from God. I understood that clearly now. Fear may control behavior, but it never transforms hearts. Then something unexpected happened. I felt compassion, not abstract, not distant, but sharp and personal. Compassion for pastors trapped by their own image. Compassion for leaders afraid to admit they were wrong. Compassion for believers who sensed something was off, but didn't know how to name it. I realized then that deception often survives, not because people are evil, but because they are afraid. Afraid of losing belonging, afraid of losing certainty, afraid of standing alone. And I understood something else. Truth will always cost you something. Comfort, reputation, security, sometimes all three. The presence made something unmistakably clear. The days ahead will require discernment, not dependence. That sentence carried weight. I was shown that many people would continue seeking safety in institutions rather than truth, that they would confuse structure with stability, that they would mistake loud voices for trustworthy ones. And I was shown something even harder to accept. Some would reject truth, not because they didn't understand it, but because it threatened what they benefited from. That knowledge hurt more than any physical pain ever could, because it meant that speaking up wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would be costly. And yet, the peace surrounding me never left, not even when I understood how difficult my return would be. Because peace, I realized, doesn't come from ease. It comes from alignment. I felt the pull again, stronger now. The return was no longer optional, and before I was drawn back, I was given something like an anchor, a certainty to carry with me. You are not responsible for how truth is received. You are only responsible for speaking it faithfully. Those words settled into me like a seal. Then the transition began. Awareness narrowed, clarity condensed, the vastness folded inward. I felt resistance, not from fear, but from grief. Grief at leaving what was real, to return to what only pretends to be. As sensation began to return, I realized something important. The hardest part of this experience wouldn't be explaining what I saw. It would be living in a world that prefers comforting lies to uncomfortable truth. Before I continue, do you believe fear is used more often than truth to control people? Have you ever chosen comfort over conviction and regretted it later? Write "I see it" or "this is hard" in the comments. Your honesty may help someone else find clarity. The peace, the light, and the presence. The peace arrived before the light, not as a feeling, but as a state of being. It wasn't relief, it wasn't happiness, it was wholeness. Every internal conflict I had carried in life simply ceased. There was no argument inside me anymore, no doubt pulling in opposite directions, no need to justify who I was or what I believed. I understood without explanation that peace isn't the absence of trouble, it's the absence of division. And then the light became clearer. Not brighter, clearer. This wasn't light as we understand it on Earth. It didn't come from above or around. It didn't cast shadows. It didn't strain the eyes. It revealed. Everything it touched became true. I realized then why people struggle to describe this experience. Our language is built for objects and limits. This light had neither. It didn't illuminate space. It illuminated meaning. In its presence, nothing was hidden. Not because secrets were exposed, but because there was no reason to hide. Shame couldn't survive there. Fear had no function. I felt known, completely, and yet more accepted than I had ever felt in my life. That was when I understood something critical. Judgment is not what we imagine it to be. There was no courtroom, no accusation, no list of failures read aloud. There was only truth. And truth, when paired with perfect love, doesn't crush you. It frees you. I became aware that the presence was no longer at a distance. It wasn't approaching. It wasn't watching. It was with me, closer than breath. And with that closeness came recognition so deep it bypassed emotion and went straight to the core of my existence. This was Jesus. Not the softened version I had heard preached, not the political symbol, not the motivational figure. This was authority. Absolute. Wrapped in love so pure it dismantled every false image I had ever been given. I didn't see a face. I didn't need to. His presence carried identity the way fire carries heat. You don't question it. You don't analyze it. You know. And in that knowing, I realized how much of what I had been taught about him was incomplete. He was gentle, but not passive. Loving, but not permissive. Patient, but not indifferent. There was no tolerance for deception here. Not because deception angered him, but because it harmed those he loved. I felt something like sorrow, but it wasn't his. It was mine. Sorrow for how easily his name had been used to justify fear. Sorrow for how often his words had been filtered through human agendas. Sorrow for how many people had learned about him without ever knowing him. And then, without words, he showed me something. Not images of disaster, not scenes of punishment, but patterns. Patterns of teaching that replaced intimacy with rules. Patterns of leadership that replaced servanthood with control. Patterns of worship that replaced reverence with performance. I understood that deception doesn't usually begin with lies. It begins with reduction. Reducing truth to what's convenient. Reducing obedience to what's visible. Reducing faith to what can be measured and managed. The light made it impossible to confuse appearance with reality. And then came the warning. Not shouted, not threatening. Clear. Many speak about me, but do not listen to me. That sentence carried more weight than anything else I heard, because it explained everything. Why churches could grow and still drift. Why leaders could preach passionately and still mislead. Why believers could feel inspired and still remain unchanged. Listening requires humility, and humility cannot survive where control is valued more than truth. I felt the urgency increase, not as panic, but as focus. Time mattered again. Not because time was short, but because opportunity was. I understood that what was coming wasn't about the end of the world. It was about the exposure of hearts. A separation, not of believers and unbelievers, but of truth and performance. I realized that many would cling harder to systems as they began to crack. That fear would drive people deeper into dependency instead of discernment. And that was dangerous, because when fear replaces truth, people stop listening. They obey. And obedience without truth becomes captivity. Jesus didn't speak this as condemnation. He spoke it as grief. And then he made something unmistakably clear to me. My church is not a building. It is not a brand. It is not protected by silence. I understood that silence, in the face of distortion, is not humility. It is participation. That truth shook me, because I had believed staying quiet was being loving. Now I saw that love sometimes disrupts, sometimes confronts, sometimes warns, and always costs. The peace never left, even as the responsibility settled heavier on me. That was the paradox. The weight increased, but so did the strength. I knew, without being told, that returning would not feel peaceful at first. That doubt would surround me, that people would dismiss this experience as imagination, emotion, or deception. But I also knew something else. Truth doesn't require agreement to remain true. And the light began to soften, not fading, but releasing me. The presence withdrew just enough for me to feel the pull again. The return. Before I was drawn back completely, one final assurance settled into me. Not spoken, but sealed. What you have seen is not for spectacle. It is for warning. Before I continue, do you believe the church confuses performance with truth? Do you think silence can sometimes be a form of participation? Write, "This hit me," or "I never thought of it this way," in the comments. Your reflection may help someone else see clearly. The encounter that changed everything. What changed everything wasn't just the presence, it was the exchange. Up until that point, I had been receiving clarity, peace, understanding. But now, something shifted. This wasn't only about what I was seeing or learning, it was about what was being asked of me. The presence of Jesus was no longer simply revealing truth, it was inviting response. And that terrified me, because revelation is comforting, but response requires courage. I sensed his attention focused on me in a way that felt deeply personal. Not isolating, but intentional. As if, in the middle of something vast and eternal, I was being addressed individually. Not because I was special, but because I was available. That realization humbled me. I understood that many people are shown truth every day, through scripture, conviction, quiet discomfort, but few are willing to sit with it long enough to be changed by it. Jesus didn't accuse me, he asked. Not with words, but with understanding that formed a question inside me. Who do you trust when truth becomes costly? Instantly, I saw moments from my life again, but this time, not as memories, as crossroads. Times when I felt the nudge to speak and didn't. Times when I sensed something was wrong and rationalized it. Times when staying comfortable felt easier than being honest. I saw how often I had delayed obedience while waiting for certainty. But certainty rarely comes before obedience. It comes after. I understood then that much of what we call waiting on God is actually fear of consequences. And fear, when left unchallenged, becomes a teacher, a false one. Jesus showed me something else, not as images, but as understanding. The difference between his voice and the voices people follow. His voice never pressured, never flattered, never manipulated. It invited and waited. Other voices demanded urgency without discernment. They promised safety through alignment. They rewarded compliance and punished questions. And suddenly, it became painfully clear why so many believers were exhausted. They weren't tired from serving God. They were tired from serving systems that replaced him. The grief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Not despair, sorrow. Sorrow for people who loved Jesus but had been taught to distrust their own discernment. Sorrow for leaders who once started with sincerity but slowly replaced listening with controlling. Sorrow for churches that mistook growth for health. Jesus didn't minimize that grief. He shared it. And that's when I felt something unexpected. Resolve. Not mine. His. I understood that what I was seeing wasn't new to him. This drift, this distortion, this quiet compromise. He had watched it unfold patiently for years. But patience does not mean indifference. And love does not mean silence. I was shown that exposure was coming. Not as punishment, but as mercy. Because deception thrives in darkness, and exposure is the first step toward healing. But exposure is uncomfortable. It disrupts identity. It challenges loyalty. It forces decisions. And not everyone wants that. I realized then why this message would be rejected by many. Because it doesn't attack unbelief. It confronts false security. And false security feels safer than truth until it collapses. Jesus made something unmistakably clear to me. Many will defend what makes them feel safe, even when it keeps them blind. That sentence settled into me with terrifying clarity, because I knew what it meant for my return. I wouldn't be celebrated. I wouldn't be welcomed. I wouldn't be believed easily. Some would accuse me of bitterness, others of deception, others of rebellion, and some, the hardest, would quietly distance themselves. Not because they thought I was wrong, but because listening would cost them too much. I felt the weight of that, and instinctively, I resisted. Isn't there another way? Can't someone else speak this? The response was gentle, but firm. Truth does not belong to the fearless. It belongs to the obedient. I understood then that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing truth despite it. Jesus showed me that the coming season would require discernment like never before, that emotional experiences would increase, that spiritual language would become louder, not quieter, and that without discernment, many would confuse intensity with truth. I was shown that some churches would double down on control as questions increased, that pressure would rise, that loyalty would be tested. And I was shown that many believers would feel something was wrong, but wouldn't know where to turn. That's when the purpose became clear. Not to destroy the church, but to call it back. Back to humility. Back to listening. Back to truth without filters. Jesus didn't ask me to convince anyone. He asked me to witness, to speak honestly, to warn gently but clearly, to refuse silence when silence protects distortion. I realized then that silence, when truth is known, is not neutrality. It's alignment. That understanding marked me deeply, because I knew I could never return to my old way of living, even if I wanted to. Once you see clearly, pretending becomes impossible. The encounter was ending, not abruptly, intentionally. I felt the pull strengthen again, more insistent now. Before the separation fully began, I sensed one final instruction settle into me, not as a command, but as a charge. Do not trade truth for belonging. Those words burned into me, because I had done exactly that before, and I knew the temptation would return. As awareness narrowed and the return approached, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, determination, not because I was strong, but because I was convinced. And conviction changes everything. Before I continue, have you ever felt truth cost you belonging? Do you think many people defend systems because leaving feels too frightening? Right, I've felt this cost, or this explains so much in the comments. You are not alone, even if it feels like it. The truth about the church that made me tremble. The truth wasn't revealed as an accusation. It was revealed as clarity. And clarity can be terrifying when you realize how long you've lived without it. What made me tremble wasn't the idea that the church could be wrong. I had already sensed that something was off. What shook me was how subtle the shift had been, and how easily it had gone unnoticed. I understood that the greatest danger wasn't outright lies. It was partial truth. Truth diluted just enough to be comfortable. Truth edited just enough to avoid resistance. Truth framed in ways that protected systems instead of people. I was shown that many churches hadn't rejected God. They had redefined obedience. Obedience had quietly shifted from listening to God to aligning with leadership, to maintaining unity at all costs, to protecting reputation. And that shift changed everything. I saw how scripture was often used selectively, not to reveal truth, but to reinforce authority. Verses about submission were emphasized. Verses about discernment were softened or ignored. The message became clear. Trust us. Don't question. Stay in line. And all of it was done in Jesus' name. That realization made me tremble, because using his name doesn't guarantee his presence. I was shown how fear had become a primary motivator. Fear of being deceived, fear of leaving, fear of losing covering, fear of being outside God's will. But fear was never meant to be the engine of faith. Fear may keep people compliant, but it never makes them holy. I understood that many believers weren't following truth. They were following safety. And safety, when it replaces discernment, becomes an idol. I saw how loyalty was praised, but only when it flowed upward. How questions were labeled as rebellion. How doubt was treated as danger rather than invitation to deeper understanding. And slowly, over time, people learned to distrust their own spiritual senses. They learned to outsource discernment. That is what broke my heart. Because discernment is not rebellion, it's responsibility. I understood that the church's problem wasn't that it had too much authority. It was that authority had lost accountability. Leaders were surrounded by affirmation instead of truth. Correction was avoided to maintain image. Transparency was sacrificed for growth. And all of it was justified as protecting the mission. But a mission that cannot withstand truth is already compromised. I was shown that many leaders didn't start with bad intentions. They started with calling. But over time, influence became intoxicating. Success became identity. And control began to feel necessary. Not because they hated people, but because they feared losing what they had built. And fear always changes how we lead. It tightens, it hardens, it silences others. I was shown something else, something even more unsettling. Many believers sensed the drift. They felt the discomfort. They noticed the contradictions. They recognized the pressure, but they stayed, not because they believed everything, but because leaving felt too costly. Community, identity, purpose. The church had become their world, and that made them vulnerable. I understood then that deception rarely chains people. It comforts them. It gives them structure without surrender, belonging without vulnerability, faith without risk. And when comfort replaces conviction, truth becomes optional. That was the truth that made me tremble. Not that the church was failing, but that it was settling. Settling for influence instead of integrity. Settling for numbers instead of depth. Settling for performance instead of presence. I felt the weight of Jesus' grief again. Not anger, grief. Because he loves his people too much to watch them be misled without warning. I understood then that his harshest words in Scripture were never aimed at broken people. They were aimed at leaders who blocked truth while claiming to represent him. And suddenly, those words made sense in a way they never had before. Not as historical criticism, but as living warning. I realized that many churches weren't lying outright. They were avoiding truth. And avoidance, when sustained long enough, becomes deception. That realization made my entire body feel weak, even without a body. Because I knew what this meant for me. Speaking this truth would not sound loving to everyone. Warning would be interpreted as attack. Discernment would be labeled division. And yet the truth didn't feel optional. It felt necessary. I understood that calling out deception doesn't require hatred. It requires courage. And courage, I now knew, was not something I possessed naturally. It had to be chosen. I was shown that the coming season would test where people placed their trust, not between God and the world, but between God and systems claiming to represent him. And many would struggle, because disentangling faith from institution feels like losing faith altogether. But they are not the same. That understanding felt like both burden and gift, because once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. And that was when I felt the return drawing closer again. Stronger, more immediate. The truth had been given. Now it had to be carried. Before I continue, have you ever felt loyalty to a church conflict with honesty? Do you think fear keeps people silent more than unbelief ever could? Write, "This is heavy," or "I've felt this tension," in the comments. Your reflection matters. even if it's uncomfortable. The urgent warning for this time. The warning didn't come with panic. It came with precision. What Jesus showed me wasn't about dates, disasters, or dramatic endings. It was far more unsettling than that, because it was already happening. Quietly, gradually, almost politely. I understood that the greatest danger facing believers right now isn't persecution from the outside. It's confusion on the inside. Confusion disguised as compassion. Confusion labeled as unity. Confusion defended as love. I was shown that we are entering a time where spiritual language will increase, not decrease. Churches will speak more boldly. Leaders will sound more confident. Messages will feel more urgent. But urgency does not equal truth, and passion does not equal alignment. Jesus made it clear that many voices would claim authority in his name, not through obvious falsehoods, but through emotional certainty, through confidence that feels convincing, through messages that feel safe. And that's the danger, because safety, when it replaces truth, dulls discernment. I was shown that discernment would become rare, not because people don't want truth, but because truth requires stillness. And stillness is uncomfortable in a culture addicted to noise. Believers would be encouraged to choose sides, to defend leaders instead of examining fruit, to protect institutions instead of listening deeply. And all of it would be justified as protecting the church. But the church does not need protection from truth. It needs protection from pride. Jesus showed me that pride doesn't always look arrogant. Sometimes it looks like certainty that refuses correction. Sometimes it looks like confidence that avoids accountability. Sometimes it looks like leaders who surround themselves with agreement instead of honesty. That kind of pride doesn't shout. It settles. And once it settles, deception finds a home. I was shown that many believers would feel an internal conflict, a quiet discomfort they couldn't quite explain. Teachings would sound right, but feel wrong. Messages would inspire, but not transform. And instead of slowing down to examine that discomfort, many would silence it. Because questioning feels dangerous. Questioning threatens belonging. Jesus made something painfully clear. Belonging is not the same as being rooted. Roots go deep. Belonging often stays shallow, and shallow faith cannot withstand pressure. I was shown that pressure is coming, not necessarily through suffering, but through choice. Choices between truth and alignment, between discernment and dependence, between obedience to God and loyalty to voices that claim to represent Him. And those choices will expose what people truly trust. I understood then why this warning felt so urgent. Not because time is running out, but because discernment is. I was shown that many churches will respond to uncertainty by tightening control, by discouraging questions, by framing dissent as danger, and many believers will mistake that control for safety. Because safety feels holy when fear is spiritualized. Jesus showed me that fear would be one of the greatest tools used, not always intentionally, but effectively. Fear of deception, fear of being misled, fear of being outside God's will. Ironically, those fears would keep people from hearing Him clearly, because fear narrows listening, and listening is essential. I understood then that this warning wasn't about leaving churches. It was about waking up inside them, about reclaiming responsibility for discernment, about testing what is taught instead of absorbing it, about remembering that obedience to God is personal before it is communal. Jesus made something unmistakably clear. I will not override discernment. He does not force clarity. He invites it. An invitation can be ignored. I was shown that many believers would prefer certainty over truth because certainty feels stable, even when it's false. Truth, on the other hand, often unsettles before it heals, and many will reject it for that reason alone. I was shown that this season will not reward those who speak the loudest. It will reveal those who listen the deepest, those willing to sit with discomfort, those willing to examine their assumptions, those willing to risk misunderstanding for the sake of alignment. Jesus wasn't warning me about the world. He was warning me about His people, not because He condemns them, but because He loves them too much to let confusion go unchallenged. I felt the weight of this warning settle into me with sobering clarity. This wasn't a message to be delivered aggressively. It was a truth to be carried carefully, because truth mishandled becomes another weapon, and that would only deepen the problem. Jesus made it clear that my role was not to accuse, but to invite reflection, to ask questions others are afraid to ask, to encourage listening over reacting, to remind people that truth does not fear examination. I understood that many would respond defensively, that some would misinterpret warning as attack, that others would dismiss it entirely, and that had to be accepted, because obedience is not measured by response. It's measured by faithfulness. The urgency of this warning wasn't about catastrophe. It was about opportunity, an opportunity to choose depth over surface, discernment over dependency, truth over comfort. And I realized something that shook me deeply. The church is not being destroyed. It is being tested. And testing always reveals what already exists. Before I continue, do you feel confusion growing within the church today? Have you ever ignored discomfort because questioning felt unsafe? Right, I feel the confusion, or I've ignored that feeling in the comments. Your honesty may help someone else listen more closely. What happens to those who follow men instead of truth? What I was shown next wasn't meant to frighten me. It was meant to wake me up. Jesus didn't show me punishment. He didn't show me fire or torment. He showed me consequences, and consequences are often far more sobering than fear. I was shown people who loved God sincerely, people who prayed, served, gave, and sacrificed. On the surface, their lives looked faithful. Their language was spiritual. Their intentions were genuine. But their trust had slowly shifted. Not away from God, but away from listening. They had learned to rely on voices instead of discernment, to follow direction instead of seeking truth, to equate agreement with obedience. And over time, something subtle but devastating happened. Their faith became secondhand. They no longer asked, "Is this true?" They asked, "Who said it?" And if the right person said it, if the voice carried authority, charisma, or familiarity, truth was assumed. That was the danger, because authority, when untested, becomes a substitute for truth. Jesus showed me how this dependence reshaped people from the inside, not dramatically, gradually. Their conscience softened. Their questions quieted. Their discomfort was explained away. They weren't hardened. They were numb. And numbness is far more dangerous than rebellion, because rebellion can be confronted. Numbness doesn't feel like a problem. I saw how following men instead of truth didn't always lead people away from faith. Sometimes it led them deeper into illusion. They felt secure. They felt certain. They felt protected. But their faith lacked resilience. When pressure came, when leaders failed, when teachings contradicted scripture, when reality clashed with promises, they shattered. Not because God failed them, but because their foundation was borrowed. Jesus showed me that when people build their faith on leaders, the fall of those leaders becomes a spiritual earthquake. Confusion, anger, disillusionment. Some walked away from church. Some walked away from faith entirely. And the tragedy was this: they didn't lose God. They lost what they thought God was. I felt the grief of that deeply, because none of it had to happen. If discernment had been encouraged, if questions had been welcomed, if truth had been prioritized over image, so much pain could have been avoided. Jesus showed me something else, something even harder to accept. Some people never realized what had happened. They remained faithful to systems long after truth had been replaced. They defended leaders they didn't truly know. They dismissed warnings as bitterness or rebellion, and they lived with a quiet, unspoken emptiness, a hunger that never went away. Because following men can never satisfy the soul. Only truth can. I understood then that the consequence of misplaced trust isn't always obvious collapse. Sometimes it's stagnation. People stop growing, stop discerning, stop listening. They repeat language they didn't discover, defend beliefs they didn't examine, fight battles they didn't choose, and they call it faith. Jesus made it clear that he does not compete with leaders, but he will not share authority over truth. When people elevate voices above discernment, they don't just risk deception, they surrender responsibility. And responsibility is a gift God does not reclaim lightly. I was shown that following men instead of truth doesn't mean those men are always wrong. Sometimes they are partially right. And partial truth is the most dangerous place to stop, because it feels safe enough to settle. I saw how loyalty was often rewarded more than honesty, how agreement opened doors while questions closed them, how people learned quickly what was acceptable to say and what was not. And slowly, the culture-shaped belief. Jesus showed me that when culture replaces conviction, faith becomes fragile. It survives only as long as the culture does. That's why some people panic when leaders are questioned, because their faith is intertwined with them. Questioning feels like threat, not to leadership, but to identity. I felt Jesus' sorrow again, because he never asked for that kind of loyalty. He never asked people to stop thinking. He never asked people to stop testing what they hear. In fact, he warned against the opposite. I understood then that the consequence of following men instead of truth is not immediate judgment. It is distance. Distance from clarity. Distance from peace. Distance from authentic relationship. People still pray, but their prayers feel empty. They still worship, but something feels missing. They still serve, but exhaustion replaces joy, and they don't know why. Jesus showed me that many believers blame themselves for this emptiness. They think they're not doing enough, not believing hard enough, not serving sacrificially enough. But the problem isn't effort, it's alignment. Truth brings rest. Control brings exhaustion. That distinction changed everything for me, because I realized how often exhaustion is spiritual, not physical. I was shown that in the coming time, many people would be forced to choose, to double down on loyalty or to return to listening, and that choice would be uncomfortable, because listening requires humility, and humility often feels like instability at first. But instability that leads to truth is better than security built on illusion. Jesus didn't show me this to condemn anyone. He showed me this because warning is an act of love, and love speaks before collapse, not after. As the return pulled closer again, I understood something with sobering clarity. Following men may feel safer in the moment, but only truth sustains when everything else is shaken. Before I continue, have you ever realized your faith depended too much on a leader or system? Do you think many people confuse loyalty with faithfulness? Write, "This opened my eyes," or "I'm rethinking a lot" in the comments. Your honesty may help someone else step back into clarity. You must go back. The words didn't feel like a command. They felt like a turning point. You must go back. Not spoken aloud, but unmistakable. And suddenly, everything inside me resisted. I didn't argue out of fear. I argued out of sorrow. Because for the first time, I understood what life could be. And I didn't want to return to what it was. Here, there was no confusion, no pressure, no performance. There was no need to prove faith, defend beliefs, or protect identity. Everything was aligned. Everything made sense. Going back felt like stepping into fog after standing in perfect clarity. I felt the weight of what awaited me on the other side. Pain, doubt, skepticism, a body that would feel fragile again, a world that would question everything I said, a church culture that would not welcome this message easily. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I was being sent back as punishment. That thought dissolved instantly. This was not punishment. This was assignment. Jesus didn't pressure me. He didn't threaten me. He simply allowed me to see the contrast, so I would understand the cost. You must go back didn't mean you owe me. It meant they need to hear. And that distinction mattered. I understood that love doesn't keep truth to itself. Love sends. I felt the weight of humanity again. Not as burden, but as responsibility. Responsibility doesn't feel heavy when it's aligned with purpose. It feels serious. And seriousness is different from fear. I sensed that if I returned, I wouldn't return unchanged. I would see everything differently. Church services would feel louder, but thinner. Spiritual language would sound familiar, but incomplete. Confidence would no longer impress me. Only truth would. That realization made returning feel lonely, because clarity often isolates before it connects. Jesus showed me that I wouldn't be asked to convince, only to testify, to speak honestly about what I saw, to ask questions others are afraid to ask, to resist pressure to soften truth for acceptance. And I was shown something that shook me deeply. Many people would recognize what I said immediately, not because they agreed, but because they had already felt it. That quiet discomfort, that unspoken tension, that sense that something wasn't wrong enough to leave, but wrong enough to ache. Those people wouldn't need convincing. They would need permission. Permission to listen again. Permission to trust discernment. Permission to believe that questioning isn't betrayal. I realized then that this message wasn't meant to attack the church. It was meant to free the people inside it. But freedom threatens control, and control rarely releases willingly. Jesus didn't hide that from me. I was shown that some doors would close, some relationships would strain, some leaders would distance themselves quietly, not because they hated me, but because what I carried disrupted balance they relied on. I felt a wave of sadness at that, not for myself, but for how fragile belonging can be when it's built on agreement instead of truth. Jesus didn't promise ease. He promised presence. And suddenly, that was enough. I realized that what I was afraid of losing, comfort, acceptance, clarity, had never truly belonged to me anyway. Only truth had, and truth had already cost him everything. That perspective changed my resistance. I felt the pull strengthen again, unmistakable now. The return was imminent. The vastness around me began to narrow. The clarity condensed. The peace remained. But it changed texture. It was no longer surrounding me. It was settling within me. Like something being placed inside, not to be felt constantly, but to be remembered when doubt came. I sensed that once I returned, the memory of this place would fade at the edges, not disappear, but soften, enough to require faith, because faith isn't needed where sight is complete. Faith is needed where obedience begins. I realized that the hardest part of returning wouldn't be the pain. It would be the temptation to doubt what I had seen, to reinterpret it, to minimize it, to stay quiet for the sake of peace. And that temptation would be strong. Jesus made one final thing clear to me before the return overtook everything else. Silence will always feel easier than truth, but silence is never neutral. Those words anchored me, because I had chosen silence before, and I knew exactly how seductive it was. As sensation began to return, faint at first, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the accident, not for the pain, but for the clarity that came from being stripped of everything familiar. I understood then that sometimes truth only becomes visible when comfort is removed. The final moments before re-entry were not dramatic. They were tender. I felt held, not restrained, not rushed, but supported, as if I was being returned with care. And just before awareness collapsed back into the physical world, I felt one final assurance settle into me. You will struggle. You will doubt. But what you have seen is real. And then, I was going back. Before I continue, have you ever sensed you were being called to speak up and resisted? Do you believe silence can sometimes cost more than honesty? Write, "I've resisted," or "I'm thinking differently now" in the comments. Your reflection matters more than you know. My mission now is to warn you. Coming back felt like waking up underwater. Sound returned first, muffled, distant, then weight, then pain. My body felt foreign, heavy, uncooperative. Every breath reminded me that I was no longer in that place of clarity. I opened my eyes to bright lights and unfamiliar faces. Voices spoke around me, but their words felt slow, clumsy, like language had lost its precision. I was alive, but everything inside me had changed. The days that followed were harder than I expected, not because of the physical recovery, though that wasn't easy, but because of the mental and spiritual dissonance. I had seen too clearly to pretend nothing happened, yet the world I returned to functioned on assumptions I could no longer accept. Doctors explained the accident, friends called it a miracle, some whispered about trauma and hallucination, but I knew. What I struggled with most wasn't disbelief from others. It was the temptation to stay silent, because silence would have been easier. I could have framed the experience as private. I could have spiritualized it without specificity. I could have avoided uncomfortable conversations, and many people expected me to. But every time I considered staying quiet, something inside me tightened. Not fear, conviction. I realized that the mission I had been given wasn't dramatic. It was relational. It wasn't about shouting warnings on street corners. It was about speaking honestly in spaces where silence is rewarded. The more I tried to return to normal, the more impossible it felt. Church services felt different now. Sermons sounded polished, but shallow. Worship felt emotional, but often distracted. I wasn't judging. I was listening differently. And that made others uncomfortable. When I gently asked questions, conversation shifted. When I hesitated to agree automatically, tension surfaced. When I spoke about discernment, people heard criticism, even when none was intended. That's when I understood something crucial. Truth doesn't disrupt because it's harsh. It disrupts because it exposes dependency. Many people depend on certainty provided by others. Truth invites responsibility, and responsibility feels threatening when you've been taught not to trust your own discernment. I began sharing my experience carefully, privately at first, one conversation at a time. Some people leaned in, eyes wide, hearts open. They said, "I felt this too. I thought it was just me. I didn't know I was allowed to question." Others pulled away, not angrily, quietly. And that hurt more than open rejection, because it revealed how conditional belonging can be. Still, I spoke, not because I wanted conflict, but because I couldn't unknow what I knew. I realized that my mission wasn't to declare that the church is lying as a blanket accusation. It was to say this: some churches have replaced listening with control. Some leaders have replaced humility with certainty. And many believers have been taught that questioning is dangerous when it is often necessary. That's the warning. Not to abandon faith, not to reject community, not to distrust everyone, but to wake up, to test what you hear, to examine fruit, not just confidence, to remember that obedience to God is never outsourced. I'm not asking you to believe my experience blindly. In fact, please don't. What I'm asking is this: are you listening or just agreeing? Are you following truth or familiarity? Are you afraid to question because you might lose belonging? Those questions changed my life, and they may change yours. My mission now is not to create fear. It's to create clarity, because clarity leads to peace, real peace, not the kind that comes from avoidance. If you feel unsettled by this story, don't rush to explain it away. Sit with it. Discomfort is often the beginning of discernment, and discernment is not rebellion. It is responsibility. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I know this: Jesus does not fear questions. Truth does not fear examination. And faith that cannot be questioned cannot grow. If you're watching this and something inside you resonates, even quietly, don't ignore it. Write it. Name it. Because silence is powerful, but so is honesty. Write in the comments: I'm questioning. I feel this tension. I need to listen again. You never know who else needs permission to be honest. And if this message helped you see differently, even a little, subscribe to the channel. Not because we have all the answers, but because this is a space where questions are allowed, discernment is encouraged, and truth matters more than comfort. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking. And thank you for being willing to look deeper. Sometimes, that's where faith truly begins.